That sound. It shouldn't exist. Trevor Johnson's hand froze on his Bentley's door handle, his phone clattering onto the cobblestones, forgotten. For 18 months, his country estate had been a monument to grief. Therapy appointments, specialist consultations, carefully managed routines designed to coax a single word from silence. His 3-year-old daughter, Emma, hadn't spoken since the night of the accident. Selective mutism, the doctors called it. Traumatic shutdown requiring years of specialized intervention. Trevor had learned to accept that diagnosis the way billionaires always do, by hiring the best experts and building walls of clinical distance around his pain. But now, laughter rang across the garden. Not tentative. Wild. Unrestrained. Alive. Before we continue, the algorithm brought you here for a reason, but it might never show you this channel again. Don't leave your growth to a random line of code. Secure your spot and subscribe so you never miss the unfair advantage everyone else is looking for. Now, let's get back to the story. Trevor's eyes locked onto the impossible scene. Emma, who hadn't smiled in over a year, who flinched at sudden movements, who psychologists said might never speak again, was clinging joyfully to the back of a young woman crawling through the grass. Her small arms wrapped tight, her blonde hair bouncing, her face buried against the woman's neck as she laughed without holding back. The woman wasn't Dr. Martinez, the child trauma specialist. She wasn't one of the developmental therapists with their clipboards and progress charts. She was Gracie, the housekeeper he'd hired 3 weeks ago, someone whose last name he couldn't remember, whose presence he barely registered. Her navy uniform was grass-stained. Those bright yellow rubber gloves flashed in the sunlight as she made ridiculous horse sounds, completely unafraid of looking foolish. Her white collar sat askew, dark hair escaping her headband, grinning with pure, unself-conscious joy. And Emma, who specialists said couldn't tolerate physical contact, who hadn't shown spontaneous joy since watching her mother die, was holding on like she'd finally found something solid. Trevor's heart slammed against his ribs. That morning, Victoria had reviewed the latest psychological assessment over breakfast. "The prognosis isn't promising," she'd said with detached compassion. "We should consider residential treatment." She'd said it like Emma was a failing business venture needing restructuring. But the child in front of him was radiant, present, trying. Every step across the grass shattered another piece of the narrative he'd been sold. In less than 3 weeks, a woman with yellow gloves had reached his daughter in ways 18 months of expensive expertise never could. Trevor knew, with ice-cold clarity, he'd been believing a lie. Not about Emma. About himself. Up close, Emma wasn't just laughing, she was engaged. Her hands gripped Gracie's shoulders with intention, her body leaning with balance and trust. This wasn't a fluke. This was connection. Gracie noticed him, slowing gently. "Easy, sweet girl. We're just playing. You're safe. You're safe." The words hit Trevor like a blow. When had anyone said that to his daughter without a treatment plan attached? Fear surged, sharp, panicked. His voice came out colder than intended. "What exactly is going on here?" Gracie froze. Emma resisted being lowered, clinging tighter with desperate fingers. Trevor's stomach dropped. He'd just done what he always did, controlled the situation, protected himself from feeling, and frightened his daughter all over again. Trevor couldn't move. His feet had rooted themselves to the cobblestones as if the earth itself demanded he witness this moment fully, completely, without the armor of distraction he'd worn for 18 months. Emma's laughter continued. Not the polite, measured sound he'd tried to coax from her during supervised play therapy sessions, but something raw and honest that seemed to come from a place he'd forgotten existed. Her small body bounced with each exaggerated movement Gracie made, her legs gripping the housekeeper's sides with a coordination the occupational therapist said would take years to develop. Years. They'd said everything would take years. The speech pathologist had drawn charts showing incremental progress measured in months. The developmental psychologist had warned him to adjust his expectations, to celebrate small victories like eye contact held for 3 seconds or a hand reaching toward a toy. They'd surrounded him with data, with carefully worded prognoses, with the clinical language of limitation. But none of them had mentioned this possibility. That his daughter might simply need someone willing to crawl through the grass and make horse sounds without fear of looking ridiculous. Gracie's voice carried across the garden, warm and unself-conscious. "Whoa there, Miss Emma. This horsey's getting tired. Should we rest by the flowers?" Emma's response wasn't words, not yet, but it was unmistakable communication. She leaned her body toward the riot of colors blooming near the stone wall, a gesture of desire, of choice, of engagement with the world around her. Trevor's throat tightened. Dr. Martinez had told him just last week that Emma showed minimal environmental awareness and limited intentional communication. She'd recommended increasing the frequency of sessions, perhaps adding art therapy, definitely continuing the structured sensory integration protocols. She'd made it sound so reasonable, so necessary, so expensive. But standing here, watching his daughter direct their play with nothing more than the tilt of her small body, Trevor felt the foundations of everything he'd built these past 18 months begin to crack. His daughter wasn't broken. She'd been waiting. And somehow, a woman he'd hired to clean his house had understood what all his money and expertise had missed. The memory hit Trevor without warning, the way it always did, sudden and visceral like a fist to the sternum. It was supposed to be him behind the wheel that night. He was supposed to drive Emma home from her grandmother's house. But a conference call had run late, some crisis in the Singapore office that couldn't wait, and Sarah had smiled that patient smile and said she'd go instead. "It's fine, Trevor. Close your deal. We'll see you at home." Except they never made it home. Black ice. An intersection. A truck driver who'd been on the road 14 hours. Sarah died on impact. Emma, strapped in her car seat, had watched her mother's life end in the front seat while rescue workers used the jaws of life to cut them free. 3 years old, and she'd witnessed the unsurvivable. Trevor had thrown money at the aftermath like a man trying to buy his way out of hell. The best child psychologists in the country. Specialists who flew in from Boston, from Stanford, from centers of excellence he'd never heard of before. Art therapy, play therapy, EMDR, sensory integration, trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. He'd written checks for treatments he couldn't pronounce, hoping one of them would give him back the daughter who'd giggled at butterfly wings and called him Daddy in a voice like sunshine. But Emma had retreated somewhere he couldn't follow. The specialists said it was her brain protecting itself, creating distance from unbearable pain. They said with time, with proper intervention, with patience measured in years, she might speak again. Might smile again. Might be able to process what she'd seen without fragmenting. They never said she might laugh like this, wild and free and utterly present. Trevor realized with crushing clarity that he hadn't been treating Emma's trauma. He'd been medicating his own guilt, surrounding it with enough professional opinions that he never had to face what he'd done. He'd sent his wife to die in his place. Trevor's paralysis shattered into motion. His legs carried him across the lawn with the same decisive energy he used in boardrooms, his jaw set, his mind already constructing the conversation he needed to have about boundaries, about protocol, about the proper way to interact with a traumatized child. Control was what he knew. Control was what kept empires running and kept pain at bay. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" The words came out sharper than he intended, edged with something that sounded like authority but tasted like panic. Gracie's body went rigid. The playfulness drained from her face, replaced by the careful blankness of someone who understood exactly how precarious her position was. She began to carefully lower herself, trying to let Emma slide gently to the grass. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Johnson. I didn't realize. I should have asked permission. I just thought. But Emma didn't let go. Her small fingers dug deeper into Gracie's uniform, her legs tightening their grip. A sound escaped her throat, wordless but desperate, a protest that was more communication than Trevor had heard from her in 18 months. Gracie froze mid-apology, torn between the powerful man standing over her and the frightened child clinging to her back. Trevor opened his mouth to order his daughter down, to reassert control, to make this moment stop threatening everything he'd carefully constructed. But Gracie spoke first, her voice quiet but steady. She needed to remember what safe feels like, sir. The sentence landed like a grenade in the space between them. Safe. Trevor's voice cracked on the word. You think crawling through the grass like an animal is. Safe doesn't always look professional, Gracie interrupted gently, her dark eyes meeting his without flinching. Sometimes it just looks like someone who's not afraid to be silly. Someone who's not constantly watching her like she's about to break. Trevor felt something crack in his chest, hairline fractures spreading through 18 months of carefully maintained composure. Trevor should have walked away. Should have ended this immediately, taken Emma inside, called Dr. Martinez to discuss this breach of therapeutic protocol. But his feet wouldn't move. Something kept him rooted there watching. Gracie shifted slowly, repositioning herself near the flower bed where butterflies danced above the blooms. Emma's head lifted, tracking their movement with eyes that were alert, focused, alive in a way Trevor hadn't seen since before the accident. Then it happened. Emma's right hand released its grip on Gracie's shoulder and reached outward, fingers stretching toward a monarch butterfly hovering near a yellow rose. The movement was clumsy, uncoordinated, but it was intentional. It was choice. Trevor's breath caught. The occupational therapist had said coordinated reaching would require at least another year of weekly sessions. They'd been working on it for months. Structured exercises with specific toys at specific angles. Progress measured in millimeters and documented in charts. But here was his daughter, reaching. Just reaching. Because she wanted to. The butterfly drifted higher. Emma's face scrunched in concentration. Not frustration, not the vacant stare he'd grown accustomed to, but genuine engaged effort. She tried again, leaning further, her body naturally adjusting for balance against Gracie's back. That's it, sweet girl, Gracie murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. They're pretty, aren't they? So many colors. And then Emma did something that made Trevor's knees weak. She turned her head, looked directly at Gracie's face, and made eye contact. Real, sustained, meaningful eye contact. 3 seconds. 5. 7. Dr. Martinez had called sustained eye contact a therapeutic milestone that might take 18 to 24 months to achieve with consistent intervention. Emma had just done it naturally, effortlessly, because she wanted to share something beautiful with someone who was present with her. Trevor felt his certainty, about the experts, about the protocols, about everything he'd been told, crumbling like sand castles at high tide. Every expensive opinion suddenly felt like a very elaborate lie. The click of heels on stone announced her before Trevor saw her. Sharp, precise, perfectly timed. The sound of Victoria Chambers approaching anything was unmistakable. She appeared at the garden entrance like she'd materialized from the pages of Forbes, her cream-colored suit immaculate, her dark hair swept into a flawless chignon, her expression already arranged into professional concern. Trevor, darling, what on earth is happening out here? Her voice carried the kind of warmth that never quite reached her eyes. I could hear the commotion from the driveway. Emma's body went rigid against Gracie's back. The reaching stopped. The light in her eyes dimmed like someone had turned down a switch. Trevor watched it happen in real time. His daughter retreating, folding inward, becoming small and silent again. In the space of 3 seconds, Victoria's presence had undone what Gracie had built in 3 weeks. Victoria's gaze swept over the scene with the analytical precision she used to dissect quarterly reports. Her eyes lingered on Gracie's grass-stained uniform, the yellow gloves, the informal positioning of adult and child. Trevor could practically see her calculating liability, assessing risk, preparing her argument. "Is this appropriate?" Victoria asked, directing the question at Trevor but keeping her eyes on Gracie. "I thought we agreed Emma needed structured therapeutic interactions. This looks," she paused, choosing her word carefully, "unprofessional." Gracie slowly, carefully helped Emma slide to the ground. The child immediately wrapped both arms around Gracie's leg, hiding her face against the navy fabric. "Mr. Johnson hired me to maintain the household," Gracie said quietly, her voice steady despite the power imbalance. "Emma came outside while I was working in the garden. I didn't think playing with her would." "That's precisely the problem," Victoria interrupted smoothly. "You didn't think. Children with Emma's condition require specialized care from trained professionals, not—" She gestured vaguely at Gracie's uniform, "domestic staff." Trevor felt something cold settle in his stomach. Victoria sounded exactly like him. Reasonable. Logical. Completely certain. Completely wrong. Victoria moved closer, her heels sinking slightly into the grass with each step. She positioned herself beside Trevor, a united front of wealth and authority. Her hand touched his arm lightly, proprietary. "Trevor, this is a liability issue. What if Emma had been hurt? What if this woman's enthusiasm had triggered a regression?" Victoria's voice dropped to the tone she used in board meetings when delivering bad news. Dr. Martinez was very clear about maintaining controlled environments. "This is the opposite of that." Trevor looked down at Emma, still clinging to Gracie's leg, her small shoulders hunched, her breathing shallow. The same posture she'd held for 18 months. The same withdrawal. The same silence. 5 minutes ago, she'd been reaching for butterflies. "We need to let her go," Victoria continued, her voice gentle but firm. "Today. No. Before this becomes a pattern Emma relies on. You know how attachment issues can complicate trauma treatment." Trevor's throat felt tight. Everything Victoria said made sense. It was logical, reasonable, exactly what he would have said himself yesterday. It was the language of control, of risk management, of protecting assets, human or otherwise, from unpredictable variables. But he'd just watched his daughter laugh for the first time in 18 months. "Gracie," Trevor heard himself say, his voice sounding distant, foreign. "You've crossed professional boundaries. This isn't appropriate behavior for household staff." The words tasted like ash. Gracie's face fell, but she nodded once, accepting. "I understand, Mr. Johnson. I'll collect my things." She tried to gently disengage from Emma, but the child's grip tightened. A sound emerged from Emma's throat, not words but something raw and desperate. Her fingers twisted in Gracie's uniform until her knuckles went white. Trevor watched the light drain from his daughter's eyes like water circling a drain. Watched her fold back into herself, becoming the empty shell he'd grown accustomed to. Victoria smiled, satisfied. "It's for the best, darling. Trust me." But Trevor wasn't sure he trusted anything anymore. Trevor stepped forward, ready to lift Emma, to carry her back to the safety of structured routines and clinical interventions. Ready to restore order. His hands reached down toward his daughter's small shoulders. And then the world stopped. "No." The word exploded from Emma like it had been trapped inside her for 18 months, fighting its way through layers of trauma and silence and fear. Her voice was hoarse, raw, scraped clean of everything except desperate need. "No. Gracie stays." Trevor's hands froze mid-reach. His heart stopped, then slammed against his ribs so hard he thought it might crack them. Behind him, He heard Victoria's sharp intake of breath. Emma wasn't looking at him. Her eyes, those blue eyes that had been vacant for so long, were locked on Gracie's face with an intensity that was almost painful to witness. Her small body trembled with the effort of forcing words through a throat that had forgotten how to shape them. "Gracie stays," she repeated, each word costing her something. Her arms released Gracie's leg and reached upward. Not toward Trevor, not toward her father who had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars trying to heal her, but toward the housekeeper in the grass-stained uniform. The choice was unmistakable. Devastating. Perfect. Trevor felt something in his chest shatter and reform simultaneously, breaking along old fault lines and rebuilding into a shape he didn't recognize. His daughter had spoken. His daughter had chosen. And she had chosen the person who crawled through grass and made hoarse sounds over the man who controlled everything except his own grief. Gracie's eyes filled with tears. She looked at Trevor, uncertain, seeking permission she probably knew she wouldn't get. Victoria's voice cut through the moment like a blade. "Trevor, this is clearly a manipulative attachment response. Dr. Martinez warned us about." "Be quiet." Trevor's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of 18 months of accumulated pain. "Just be quiet." His daughter had spoken, and he was finally ready to listen. Trevor couldn't sleep. He'd sent Victoria back to the city with excuses about needing time to think, to process, to make rational decisions. She'd left with a warning about emotional decision-making and a reminder to call Dr. Martinez first thing in the morning. Instead, he found himself walking the dark hallways of his estate at 2 in the morning, his bare feet silent on imported marble that suddenly felt obscenely expensive. Light spilled from beneath Emma's door. Not the harsh fluorescent glow of the medical-grade nightlight the sleep specialist had recommended, but something softer. Warmer. Trevor approached slowly, his hand hovering over the doorknob before he decided simply to look through the gap where the door stood slightly ajar. Gracie sat cross-legged on the floor beside Emma's bed, still wearing her uniform though it was well past any reasonable working hour. Her hands moved slowly through the air, fingers dancing in patterns that caught the lamplight. She was humming, something low and melodic that Trevor didn't recognize, probably a song from her own childhood. "This little piggy went to market," Gracie whispered, gently touching each of Emma's tiny fingers in turn. "This little piggy stayed home." Emma's hand lay open in Gracie's palm, trusting, receptive. And then Trevor's breath caught, Emma's other hand lifted. Clumsy, uncertain, but deliberately mimicking Gracie's movements. Her small fingers tried to make the same patterns in the air, failing, trying again. Gracie didn't correct her, didn't measure the accuracy of the movement or document it for a progress report. She simply smiled and adjusted her own hands to match Emma's attempts, validating the effort rather than critiquing the execution. "That's beautiful, sweet girl. You're doing it your own way. That's perfect." Trevor pressed his forehead against the doorframe, something breaking open in his chest. This was what he'd denied his daughter. Not therapy or intervention or specialized care, but this simple human presence without agenda. Warmth without clinical distance. Play without measurement or documentation or therapeutic goals. Someone who stayed not because they were paid to fix her, but because they genuinely wanted to be there. Trevor sat in his study as dawn broke over the estate, the same leather chair where he'd taken that conference call 18 months ago. The call that had cost Sarah her life. The call he'd prioritized over driving his own daughter home. The truth settled over him like weight, heavy and inescapable. He hadn't surrounded Emma with experts to help her heal. He'd surrounded her with experts to avoid facing what he'd done. Every specialist, every therapy session, every clinical intervention had been a wall between him and the unbearable reality that his choices had consequences he couldn't buy his way out of. Dr. Martinez, with her careful prognosis and measured timelines, had given him something precious. Permission to wait. Permission to keep his distance. Permission to believe that Emma's healing required professional expertise he didn't possess, so he could justify his own emotional absence. But Gracie hadn't needed permission. She'd simply shown up. Grass stains, yellow gloves, silly horse sounds and all. She'd given Emma what Trevor couldn't. Genuine presence without the crushing weight of guilt. Warmth without the fear of failure. Play without the terror of hope. She'd risked looking foolish, unprofessional, inappropriate. And in that risk, she'd reached his daughter in ways $1 billion never could. Trevor looked at his hands, the same hands that had signed 7-figure checks for treatments, the same hands that had reached for his phone instead of his car keys that night, the same hands that had frozen this afternoon instead of embracing his daughter when she finally spoke. He had a choice now. He could call Dr. Martinez this morning, let Victoria's logic win, fire Gracie and return to the comfortable certainty of controlled environments and clinical distance. He could keep hiding behind expertise and expensive interventions, could continue medicating his guilt with professional opinions. Or he could do the thing that terrified him most. Show up. Be present. Risk feeling everything he'd been running from for 18 months. His daughter had already made her choice. She'd chosen connection over control, presence over protocol. Now it was his turn. Trevor stood from his chair as morning light filled the study. His decision made. He walked down the hallway toward Emma's room, each step feeling like the first honest movement he'd made in 18 months. Healing doesn't live in the things we buy or control. It lives in the moments we're brave enough to be present. Trevor had spent a fortune trying to fix his daughter when what she needed was simply for him to sit on the floor and be with her. To crawl through the grass. To look foolish. To risk hope even when hope felt dangerous. He'd been so busy managing his guilt, scheduling appointments, consulting experts, that he'd avoided the one thing Emma needed most. Her father. Not his money. Not his connections. Just him, broken, grieving, imperfect, but present. As he reached for Emma's door, he realized that Gracie hadn't performed a miracle. She'd simply done what he'd been too afraid to do. She'd shown up without armor, without agenda, without the need to control the outcome. She'd offered her presence, and that presence had been enough. The question that haunted him now would haunt him forever if he didn't answer it honestly. Who are you avoiding by staying too busy to feel? For Trevor, the answer was clear. He'd been avoiding himself, the man who'd made a choice that cost his wife her life, the father who'd failed to be present when his daughter needed him most. But this morning that would change. He opened the door softly. Emma was awake, sitting up in bed. When she saw him, she didn't retreat. She simply watched, waiting to see who he would choose to be. Trevor sat down on the floor beside her bed. Not in the chair, not at a professional distance, but right there on the carpet where Gracie had sat hours before. "Good morning, sweetheart," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Daddy's here." And for the first time in 18 months, he meant it.